Chapter 6 Magic was the most entertaining Vegas show that Elliot Stryker had ever seen. The program opened with an electrifying rendition of that old black magic. Singers and dancers, brilliantly costumed, performed in a stunning set constructed of mirrored steps and mirrored panels. When the stage lights were periodically dimmed, a score of revolving crystal ballroom chandeliers cast swirling splinters of color that seemed to coalesce into supernatural forms that capered under the proscenium arch. The choreography was complex, and the two lead singers had strong, clear voices. The opening number was followed by a first-rate magic act in front of the drawn curtains. Less than 10 minutes later, when the curtains opened again, the mirrors had been taken away, and the stage had been transformed into an ice rink. The second production number was done on skates against a winter backdrop so real that it made Elliot shiver. Although magic excited the imagination and commanded the eye, Elliot wasn't able to give his undivided attention to it. He kept looking at Christina Evans, who was as dazzling as the show she had created. She watched the performers intently, unaware of his gaze. A flickering, nervous scowl played across her face, alternating with a tentative smile that appeared when the audience laughed, applauded, or gasped in surprise. She was singularly beautiful. Her shoulder-length hair, deep brown, almost black, glossy, swept across her brow, feathered back at the sides, and framed her face as though it were a painting by a great master. The bone structure of that face was delicate, clearly defined, quintessentially feminine. Dusky, olive complexion. Full, sensuous mouth. And her eyes. She would have been lovely enough if her eyes had been dark, in harmony with the shade of her hair and skin, but they were crystalline blue. The contrast between her Italian good looks and her Nordic eyes was devastating. Elliot supposed that other people might find flaws in her face. Perhaps some would say that her brow was too wide. Her nose was so straight that some might think it was severe. Others might say that her mouth was too wide, her chin too pointed. To Elliot, however, her face was perfect. But her physical beauty was not what most excited him. He was interested primarily in learning more about the mind that could create a work like magic. He had seen less than 1/4 of the program, yet he knew it was a hit, and far superior to others of its kind. A Vegas stage extravaganza could easily go off the rails. If the gigantic sets and lavish costumes and intricate choreography were overdone, or if any element was improperly executed, the production would quickly stumble across the thin line between captivating showbiz flash and sheer vulgarity. A glittery fantasy could metamorphose into a crude, tasteless, and stupid bore if the wrong hand guided it. Elliot wanted to know more about Christina Evans, and on a more fundamental level, he just wanted her. No woman had affected him so strongly since Nancy, his wife, who had died 3 years ago. Sitting in the dark theater, he smiled, not at the comic magician who was performing in front of the closed stage curtains, but at his own sudden, youthful exuberance. Chapter 7. The warped door groaned and creaked as Vivian Nettler forced it open. A wave of frigid air washed out of the dark room, into the hallway. Vivian reached inside, fumbled for the light switch, found it, and entered warily. The room was deserted. Baseball stars and horror movie monsters gazed at Vivian from posters stapled to the walls. 3 intricate model airplanes were suspended from the ceiling. These things were as they always had been, since she had first come to work here, before Danny had died. The maddening electronic squeal issued from a pair of small stereo speakers that hung on the wall behind the bed. The CD player and an accompanying AM/FM tuner and amplifier were stacked on one of the nightstands. Although Vivian could see where the noise originated, she couldn't locate any source for the bitterly cold air. Neither window was open, and even if one had been raised, the night wasn't frigid enough to account for the chill. Just as she reached the AM/FM tuner, the banshee wail stopped. The sudden silence had an oppressive weight. Gradually, as her ears stopped ringing, Vivian perceived the soft empty hiss of the stereo speakers. Then she heard the thumping of her own heart. The metal casing of the radio gleamed with a brittle crust of ice. She touched it wonderingly. A sliver of ice broke loose under her finger and fell onto the nightstand. It didn't begin to melt, the room was cold. The window was frosted. The dresser mirror was frosted too, and her reflection was dim and distorted and strange. Outside, the night was cool but not wintry. Maybe 50 degrees. Maybe even 55. The radio's digital display began to change, the orange numbers escalating across the frequency band, sweeping through one station after another. Scraps of music, split-second flashes of disc jockeys' chatter, single words from different somber-voiced newscasters, and fragments of commercial jingles blended in a cacophonous jumble of meaningless sound. The indicator reached the end of the bandwidth, and the digital display began to sequence backward. Trembling, Vivian switched off the radio. As soon as she took her finger off the push switch, the radio turned itself on again. She stared at it, frightened and bewildered. The digital display began to sequence up the band once more, and scraps of music blasted from the speakers. She pressed the on/off bar again. After a brief silence, the radio turned on spontaneously. "This is crazy," she said shakily. When she shut off the radio the third time, she kept her finger pressed against the on/off bar. For several seconds she was certain that she could feel the switch straining under her fingertip as it tried to pop on. Overhead, the 3 model airplanes began to move. Each was hung from the ceiling on a length of fishing line, and the upper end of each line was knotted to its own eye hook that had been screwed firmly into the drywall. The planes jiggled, jerked, twisted, and trembled. Just a draft. But she didn't feel a draft. The model planes began to bounce violently up and down on the ends of their lines. "God help me," Vivian said. One of the planes swung in tight circles, faster and faster, then in wider circles, steadily decreasing the angle between the line on which it was suspended and the bedroom ceiling. After a moment the other 2 models ceased their erratic dancing and began to spin around and around, like the first plane, as if they were actually flying, and there was no mistaking this deliberate movement for the random effects of a draft. Ghosts? A poltergeist. But she didn't believe in ghosts. There were no such things. She believed in death and taxes, in the inevitability of slot machine jackpots, in all-you-can-eat casino buffets for $5.95 per person, in the Lord God Almighty, in the truth of alien abductions and Bigfoot, but she didn't believe in ghosts. The sliding closet doors began to move on their runners, and Vivian Nettler had the feeling that some awful thing was going to come out of the dark space, its eyes as red as blood and its razor-sharp teeth gnashing. She felt a presence, something that wanted her, and she cried out as the door came all the way open. But there wasn't a monster in the closet. It contained only clothes. Only clothes. Nevertheless, untouched, the doors glided shut. And then open again. The model planes went around, around. The air grew even colder. The bed started to shake. The legs at the foot rose 3 or 4 inches before crashing back into the casters, that had been put under them to protect the carpet. They rose up again. Hovered above the floor. The springs began to sing as if metal fingers were strumming them. Vivian backed into the wall, eyes wide, hands fisted at her sides. As abruptly as the bed had started bouncing up and down, it now stopped. The closet doors closed with a jarring crash, but they didn't open again. The model airplane slowed, swinging in smaller and smaller circles, until they finally hung motionless. The room was silent. Nothing moved. The air was getting warmer. Gradually Vivian's heartbeat subsided from the hard, frantic rhythm that it had been keeping for the past couple of minutes. She hugged herself and shivered. A logical explanation. There had to be a logical explanation. But she wasn't able to imagine what it could be. As the room grew warm again, the doorknobs and the radio casing and the other metal objects quickly shed their fragile skins of ice, leaving shallow puddles on furniture and damp spots in the carpet. The frosted window cleared, and as the frost faded from the dresser mirror, Vivian's distorted reflection resolved into a more familiar image of herself. Now this was only a young boy's bedroom, a room like countless thousands of others. Except, of course, that the boy who had once slept here had been dead for a year. And maybe he was coming back, haunting the place. Vivian had to remind herself that she didn't believe in ghosts. Nevertheless, it might be a good idea for Tina Evans to get rid of the boy's belongings at last. Vivian had no logical explanation for what had happened, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to tell anyone what she had seen here tonight. Regardless of how convincingly and earnestly she described these bizarre events, no one would believe her. They would nod and smile woodenly and agree that it was a strange and frightening experience, but all the while, they would be thinking that poor old Vivian was finally getting senile. Sooner or later word of her rantings about poltergeists might get back to her daughter in Sacramento, and then the pressure to move to California would become unbearable. Vivian wasn't going to jeopardize her precious independence. She left the bedroom, returned to the kitchen, and drank 2 shots of Tina Evans's best bourbon. Then, with characteristic stoicism, she returned to the boy's bedroom to wipe up the water from the melted ice, and she continued house cleaning. She refused to let a poltergeist scare her off. It might be wise, however, to go to church on Sunday. She hadn't been to church in a long time. Maybe some churching would be good for her. Not every week, of course. Just 1 or 2 masses a month. And confession now and then. She hadn't seen the inside of a confessional in ages. Better safe than sorry. Chapter 8. Everyone in show business knew that non-paying preview crowds were among the toughest to please. Free admission didn't guarantee their appreciation or even their amicability. The person who paid a fair price for something was likely to place far more value on it than the one who got the same item for nothing. That old saw applied in spades to stage shows and to on-the-cuff audiences. But not tonight. This crowd wasn't able to sit on its hands and keep its cool. The final curtain came down at 8 minutes till 10 o'clock, and the ovation continued until after Tina's wristwatch had marked the hour. The cast of Magic took several bows, then the crew, then the orchestra, all of them flushed with the excitement of being part of an unqualified hit. At the insistence of the happy, boisterous, VIP audience, both Joel Bandieri and Tina were spotlighted in their booths and were rewarded with their own thunderous round of applause. Tina was on an adrenaline high, grinning, breathless, barely able to absorb the overwhelming response to her work. Helen Mainway chattered excitedly about the spectacular special effects, and Elliot Stryker had an endless supply of compliments as well as some astute observations about the technical aspects of the production, and Charlie Mainway poured a third bottle of Dom PS 233, Rignan, and the house lights came up, and the audience reluctantly began to leave, and Tina hardly had a chance to sip her champagne because of all the people who stopped by the table to congratulate her. By 10:30 most of the audience had left and those who hadn't gone yet were in line, moving up the steps toward the rear doors of the showroom. Although no second show was scheduled this evening, as would be the case every night henceforth, busboys and waitresses were busily clearing tables, resetting them with fresh linen and silverware for the following night's 8 o'clock performance. When the aisle in front of her booth was finally empty of well-wishers, Tina got up and met Joel as he started to come to her. She threw her arms around him and, much to her surprise, began to cry with happiness. She hugged him hard, and Joel proclaimed the show to be a gargantua if I ever saw one. By the time they got backstage, the opening night party was in full swing. The sets and props had been moved from the main floor of the stage, and 8 folding tables had been set up. The tables were draped with white cloths and burdened with food: 5 hot hors d'oeuvres, lobster salad, crab salad, pasta salad, filet mignon, chicken breasts and tarragon sauce, roasted potatoes, cakes, pies, tarts, fresh fruits, berries, and cheeses. Hotel management personnel, showgirls, dancers, magicians, crewmen, and musicians crowded around the tables, sampling the offerings while Philip Chevalier, the hotel's executive chef, personally watched over the affair. Knowing this feast had been laid on for the party, few of those present had eaten dinner, and most of the dancers had eaten nothing since a light lunch. They exclaimed over the food and clustered around the portable bar. With the memory of the applause still fresh in everyone's mind, the party was soon jumping. Tina mingled, moving back and forth, upstage and downstage, through the crowd, thanking everyone for his contribution to the show's success, complimenting each member of the cast and crew on his dedication and professionalism. Several times, she encountered Elliot Stryker, and he seemed genuinely interested in learning how the splashy stage effects had been achieved. Each time that Tina moved on to talk to someone else, she regretted leaving Elliot, and each time that she found him again, she stayed with him longer than she had before. After their 4th encounter, she lost track of how long they were together. Finally, she forgot all about circulating. Standing near the left proscenium pillar, out of the main flow of the party, they nibbled at pieces of cake, talking about magic. And then about the law, Charlie and Helen Mainway, Las Vegas real estate, and, by some circuitous route, superhero movies. He said, "How can Batman wear an armored rubber suit all the time and not have a chronic crash?" Yeah, but there are advantages to a rubber suit. Such as? You can go straight from office work to scuba diving without changing clothes. Eat takeout food at 200 miles an hour in the Batmobile, and no matter how messy it gets, just hose off later. Exactly. After a hard day of crime fighting, you can get stinking drunk and throw up on yourself, and it doesn't matter. No dry cleaning bills. In basic black he's dressed for any occasion, from an audience with the Pope to a Marquis de Sade memorial sock hop. Elliot smiled. He finished his cake. "I guess you'll have to be here most nights for a long time to come." Number. There's really no need for me to be. I thought a director, most of the director's job is finished. I just have to check on the show once every couple of weeks to make sure the tone of it isn't drifting away from my original intention. But you are also the co-producer. Well, now that the show's opened successfully, most of my share of the producer's chores are public relations and promotional stuff. And a little logistics to keep the production rolling along smoothly. But nearly all of that can be handled out of my office. I won't have to hang around the stage. In fact, Joel says it isn't healthy for a producer to be backstage every night. Or even most nights. He says I'd just make the performers nervous and cause the technicians to look over their shoulders for the boss when they should have their eyes on their work. But will you be able to resist? It won't be easy staying away. But there's a lot of sense in what Joel says, so I'm going to try to play it cool. Still, I guess you'll be here every night for the first week or so. No, she said. If Joel's right, and I'm sure he is, then it's best to get in the habit of staying away right from the start. Tomorrow night? Oh, I'll probably pop in and out a few times. I guess you'll be going to a New Year's Eve party. I hate New Year's Eve parties. Everyone's drunk and boring. Well, then, in between all that popping in and out of magic, do you think you'd have time for dinner? Are you asking me for a date? I'll try not to slurp my soup. You're asking me for a date, she said, pleased. Yes. And it's been a long time since I've been this awkward about it. Why is that? You, I guess. I make you feel awkward? You make me feel young. And when I was young, I was very awkward. That's sweet. I'm trying to charm you. And succeeding, she said. He had such a warm smile. Suddenly I don't feel so awkward anymore. She said, "You want to start over? Will you have dinner with me tomorrow night?" "Sure. How about 7:30? "Fine. You prefer dressy or casual?" "Blue jeans." He fingered his starched collar and the satin lapel of his tuxedo jacket. "I'm so glad you said that. I'll give you my address." She searched her purse for a pen. "We can stop in here and watch the first few numbers in Magic. And then go to the restaurant." "Why don't we just go straight to the restaurant?" "You don't want to pop in here?" "I've decided to go cold turkey." "Joel will be proud of you." "If I can actually do it, I'll be proud of me." "You'll do it. You've got true grit." In the middle of dinner, I might be seized by a desperate need to dash over here and act like a producer. I'll park the car in front of the restaurant door, and I'll leave the engine running just in case. Tina gave her address to him, and then somehow they were talking about jazz and Benny Goodman, and then about the miserable service provided by the Las Vegas phone company, just chatting away as if they were old friends. He had a variety of interests. Among other things, he was a skier and a pilot, and he was full of funny stories about learning to ski and fly. He made her feel comfortable. Yet at the same time, he intrigued her. He projected an interesting image, a blend of male power and gentleness, aggressive sexuality and kindness. A hit show. Lots of royalty checks to look forward to. An infinity of new opportunities made available to her because of this first smashing success. And now the prospect of a new and exciting lover. As she listed her blessings, Tina was astonished at how much difference 1 year could make in a life. From bitterness, pain, tragedy, and unrelenting sorrow, she had turned around to face a horizon lit by rising promise. At last, the future looked worth living. Indeed, she couldn't see how anything could go wrong. Chapter 9. The skirts of the night were gathered around the Evans house, rustling in a dry desert wind. A neighbor's white cat crept across the lawn, stalking a wind-tossed scrap of paper. The cat pounced, missed its prey, stumbled, scared itself, and flashed lightning quick into another yard. Inside, the house was mostly silent. Now and then, the refrigerator switched on, purring to itself. A loose window pane in the living room rattled slightly whenever a strong gust of wind struck it. The heating system rumbled to life, and for a couple of minutes at a time, the blower whispered wordlessly as hot air pushed through the vents. Shortly before midnight, Danny's room began to grow cold. On the doorknob, on the radio casing, and on other metal objects, moisture began to condense out of the air. The temperature plunged rapidly, and the beads of water froze. Frost formed on the window. The radio clicked on. For a few seconds the silence was split by an electronic squeal as sharp as an axe blade. Then the shrill noise abruptly stopped, and the digital display flashed with rapidly changing numbers. Snippets of music and shards of voices crackled in an eerie audio montage that echoed and re-echoed off the walls of the frigid room. No one was in the house to hear it. The closet door opened, closed, opened. Inside the closet, shirts and jeans began to swing wildly on the pole from which they hung, and some clothes fell to the floor. The bed shook. The display case that held 9 model airplanes rocked, banging repeatedly against the wall. One of the models was flung from its shelf, then 2 more, then 3 more, then another, until all 9 lay in a pile on the floor. On the wall to the left of the bed, a poster of the creature from the Alien movies tore down the middle. The radio ceased scanning, stopping on an open frequency that hissed and popped with distant static. Then a voice blared from the speakers. It was a child's voice. A boy. There were no words. Just a long, agonized scream. The voice faded after a minute, but the bed began to bang up and down. The closet door slammed open and shut with substantially more force than it had earlier. Other things began to move too. For almost 5 minutes, the room seemed to have come alive. And then it died. Silence returned. The air grew warm again. The frost left the window, and outside the white cat still chased the scrap of paper. Chapter 10. Tina didn't get home from the opening night party until shortly before 2 o'clock Wednesday morning. Exhausted, slightly tipsy, she went directly to bed and fell into a sound sleep. Later, after no more than 2 dreamless hours, she suffered another nightmare about Danny. He was trapped at the bottom of a deep hole. She heard his frightened voice calling to her, and she peered over the edge of the pit, and he was so far below her that his face was only a tiny, pale smudge. He was desperate to get out, and she was frantic to rescue him, but he was chained, unable to climb, and the sides of the pit were sheer and smooth, so she had no way to reach him. Then a man dressed entirely in black from head to foot, his face hidden by shadows, appeared at the far side of the pit and began to shovel dirt into it. Danny's cry escalated into a scream of terror. He was being buried alive. Tina shouted at the man in black, but he ignored her and kept shoveling dirt on top of Danny. She edged around the pit, determined to make the hateful bastard stop what he was doing, but he took a step away from her for every step that she took toward him, and he always stayed directly across the hole from her. She couldn't reach him, and she couldn't reach Danny, and the dirt was up to the boy's knees, and now up to his hips, and now over his shoulders. Danny wailed and shrieked, and now the earth was even with his chin, but the man in black wouldn't stop filling in the hole. She wanted to kill the bastard, club him to death with his own shovel. When she thought of clubbing him, he looked at her, and she saw his face, a fleshless skull with rotting skin stretched over the bones, burning red eyes, a yellow-toothed grin. A disgusting cluster of maggots clung to the man's left cheek and to the corner of his eye, feeding off him. Tina's terror over Danny's impending entombment was suddenly mixed with fear for her own life. Though Danny's screams were increasingly muffled, they were even more urgent than before, because the dirt began to cover his face and pour into his mouth. She had to get down to him and push the earth away from his face before he suffocated, so in blind panic she threw herself over the edge of the pit, into the terrible abyss, falling and falling. Gasping, shuddering, she wrenched herself out of sleep. She was convinced that the man in black was in her bedroom, standing silently in the darkness, grinning. Heart pounding, she fumbled with the bedside lamp. She blinked in the sudden light and saw that she was alone. "Jesus," she said weakly. She wiped one hand across her face, sloughing off a film of perspiration. She dried her hand on the sheets. She did some deep breathing exercises, trying to calm herself. She couldn't stop shaking. In the bathroom, she washed her face. The mirror revealed a person whom she hardly recognized, a haggard, bloodless, sunken-eyed fright. Her mouth was dry and sour. She drank a glass of cold water. Back in bed, she didn't want to turn off the light. Her fear made her angry with herself, and at last, she twisted the switch. The returning darkness was threatening. She wasn't sure she would be able to get any more sleep, but she had to try. It wasn't even 5 o'clock. She'd been asleep less than 3 hours. In the morning, she would clean out Danny's room. Then the dreams would stop. She was pretty much convinced of that. She remembered the 2 words that she had twice erased from Danny's chalkboard, "not dead," and she realized that she'd forgotten to call Michael. She had to confront him with her suspicions. She had to know if he'd been in the house, in Danny's room, without her knowledge or permission. It had to be Michael. She could turn on the light and call him now. He would be sleeping, but she wouldn't feel guilty if she woke him, not after all the sleepless nights that he had given her. Right now, however, she didn't feel up to the battle. Her wits were dulled by wine and exhaustion. And if Michael had slipped into the house like a little boy playing a cruel prank, if he had written that message on the chalkboard, then his hatred of her was far greater than she had thought. He might even be a desperately sick man. If he became verbally violent and abusive, if he were irrational, she would need to have a clear head to deal with him. She would call him in the morning when she had regained some of her strength. She yawned and turned over and drifted off to sleep. She didn't dream anymore, and when she woke at 10 o'clock, she was refreshed and newly excited by the previous night's success. She phoned Michael, but he wasn't home. Unless he'd changed shifts in the past 6 months, he didn't go to work until noon. She decided to try his number again in half an hour. After retrieving the morning newspaper from the front stoop, she read the rave review of Magic, written by the Review Journal's entertainment critic. He couldn't find anything wrong with the show. His praise was so effusive that, even reading it by herself, in her own kitchen, she was slightly embarrassed by the effusiveness of the praise. She ate a light breakfast of grapefruit juice and 1 English muffin, then went to Danny's room to pack his belongings. When she opened the door, she gasped and halted. The room was a mess. The airplane models were no longer in the display case, they were strewn across the floor, and a few were broken. Danny's collection of paperbacks had been pulled from the bookcase and tossed into every corner. The tubes of glue, miniature bottles of enamel, and model crafting tools that had stood on his desk were now on the floor with everything else. A poster of one of the movie monsters had been ripped apart, it hung from the wall in several pieces. The action figures had been knocked off the headboard. The closet doors were open, and all the clothes inside appeared to have been thrown on the floor. The game table had been overturned. The easel lay on the carpet, the chalkboard facing down. Shaking with rage, Tina slowly crossed the room, carefully stepping through the debris. She stopped at the easel, set it up as it belonged, hesitated, then turned the chalkboard toward her. "Not dead, damn!" she said, furious. Vivian Nettler had been in to clean last evening, but this wasn't the kind of thing that Vivian would be capable of doing. If the mess had been here when Vivian arrived, the old woman would have cleaned it up and would have left a note about what she'd found. Clearly, the intruders had come in after Mrs. Nettler had left. Fuming, Tina went through the house, meticulously checking every window and door. She could find no sign of forced entry. In the kitchen again, she phoned Michael. He still didn't answer. She slammed down the handset. She pulled the telephone directory from a drawer and leafed through the yellow pages until she found the advertisements for locksmiths. She chose the company with the largest ad. Linen Lock and Security. Your ad in the yellow pages says you can have a man here to change my locks in 1 hour. That's our emergency service. It costs more. I don't care what it costs, Tina said. But if you just put your name on our work list, we'll most likely have a man there by 4 o'clock this afternoon, tomorrow morning at the latest. And the regular service is 40% cheaper than an emergency job. Vandals were in my house last night, Tina said. What a world we live in, said the woman at Anderlinen. They wrecked a lot of stuff. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. So I want the locks changed immediately. Of course. And I want good locks installed. The best you've got. Just give me your name and address, and I'll send a man out right away. A couple of minutes later, having completed the call, Tina went back to Danny's room to survey the damage again. As she looked over the wreckage, she said, "What the hell do you want from me, Mike?" She doubted that he would be able to answer that question even if he were present to hear it. What possible excuse could he have? What twisted logic could justify this sort of sick behavior? It was crazy, hateful. She shivered,